Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the March webinar of SLDS. Our speaker today is Dr. Jason Klusowski from Princeton University. Jason is assistant professor in the Department of Operation Research and Financial Engineering, and he got his PhD in 2018 in statistical and data science from Yale. His research interest includes trade-offs among interpretability, statistical accuracy, and computational feasibility in learning algorithm. He's the recipient of the NSF Career Award. And today he's going to tell us pointwise behavior of recursive partitioning and its implications for heterogeneous causal effect estimation. So welcome, Jason.
So thanks a lot. Yeah, it's really good to be here. It's my first time doing this ASA webinar. So yeah, I'm really excited. So yeah, as was mentioned, so today what I'm going to be talking about are some of the properties of decision trees and their effect on various statistical learning tasks. So I do want to mention, first of all, that this is joint work with my former student, Peter Tian, who's now at 2 Sigma Investments, as well as my colleague here at Princeton, Matias Cattaneo. So what's the motivation, or at least the introduction for the talk? So as data-driven technologies continue to be deployed in high-stakes decision environments, I mean, the need for rapidly computable and also interpretable learning algorithms has never been more important. And from these sets of criterion, it's become increasingly common to use decision trees for doing this. And specifically, the decision trees I'm thinking about are those that are constructed by a procedure called adaptive recursive partitioning, which I will get to in a few moments. And these trees are used for inferential or tasks on, let's say, a predictive or a causal model. So the setting of the talk will be in either one of those settings. So either a predictive or a causal model. Okay, so now why specifically decision trees? Well, some of the applications for why decision trees are used are appealing because there's a nice connection between decision trees and rule-based decision making. So particularly in clinical, legal, or business contexts. And the reason for this is just because the way that the decision tree forms its output mimics the way that a human user may think and reason. So sort of this sequential sequence of steps that you arrive at an answer to given a set of input values. Okay, and the other thing that is appealing about decision trees is that the construction is data adaptive. And so in other words, it takes into account specific features of the underlying data generating process. Okay, so again, we'll get into that construction in a second. Okay, so while these data adaptive rule-based decision trees are powerful, they're not without their pitfalls. And so this talk is really going to be a bit of a negative talk about decision trees. And it's going to be in a certain context. So if you're just interested, let's say, in controlling, let's say, mean squared error, so you're just interested in controlling the predictive accuracy of trees at an average or typical value of the covariates, the predictor values, well, then, trees are actually not bad. And there are certain theoretical guarantees that will ensure that that's the case. The setting of my talk is really going to be about using trees for doing pointwise or uniform inference over the entire support of the covariates. So you really are specifically interested in how well the decision tree estimates let's say a conditional average treatment effect or a conditional response function, so like a regression function, at a very specific value of the covariates, so for a fixed value of the covariates. So really what you're interested in now is controlling the behavior of the tree uniformly over the covariates. Okay, so that's specifically going to be the setting that I'm going to look at. And we're not just going to be interested necessarily in empirical support of this. So we're going to be interested in actually being able to come up with a concrete setting in which you can actually prove that these decision trees will fail. Okay, so it's very rigorous in this sense. So what are the two statistical tasks that I have in mind? So the one that I'm probably going to focus on for the majority of the talk is going to be a regression framework. And part of the reason is just it's a little bit easier to understand and to discuss the results in that context. Okay, so what am I thinking of for the regression framework? Well, I just observe n IID draws where I observe or I have a covariate of interest. So this is going to be a p-dimensional vector, and I'm going to assume that the support of this vector here is on some set, which I'm going to call x. Okay, and then y here is just some real value variable. And then in this context, the goal here would be to estimate the conditional mean response here. Okay, and so as I said, if you're just interested in, let's say, estimating this conditional expectation for an average or typical values of the x's, then decision trees are actually not that bad. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there are results that'll give you formal guarantees for that. Okay. The second setting is a potential outcome setting. So this is more of a causal model. So here what I observe is an outcome variable of interest and a set of pre-treatment variables, and then a binary variable here which indicates whether a particular unit received a treatment or not. Okay, so this is the potential outcomes framework because what I observe is either the potential outcome of that particular unit if the treatment was applied, or the potential outcome if the treatment wasn't applied. But of course, for each unit, I don't actually see both. So I don't know for each unit, I don't know what the outcome would have been for both the treatment and both the control. Okay, and so in this setting, then what I want to do is I want to estimate the conditional average treatment effect. So that would be the effect of applying the particular treatment, but condition on the pre-intervention variables here, so these x's. Okay, so in the context, so just to give you a kind of a concrete example of this, the y might represent, for example, sales revenue from a company or business engaging in some kind of marketing campaign, right? And then the x here, the set of pre-treatment variables might be, for example, like different micro or macroeconomic indicators. Okay, and so what you would want to do then is you would want to say, okay, well, for a specific value of those sets of pre-intervention variables, what is the treatment effect going to be? Okay, and so the idea in this case here, so that this is sort of suggestive that you're thinking of the treatment effect as being different according to different subgroups of the population, so different pre-treatment variables. Okay, and you might actually think that, for example, decision trees are kind of naturally suited to this, right? Because they're going to partition up the support set based on values of the treatment effects. So you could consider them to be natural contenders. And indeed, sort of in a broader context, right, with the plethora of data that's being used now from large scale randomized experiments, observational studies, machine learning is kind of being used all over the place in this particular context. And the talk today is going to explore one particular machine learning algorithm, which is trees. Okay, but again, you don't necessarily have to use trees for this, right? You could use other things. For example, you could use neural networks, as is becoming more popular now. Okay, so I kind of introduced the setting now. Now, really, what I want to tell you about are the nuts and bolts of how the trees are actually constructed. So, what are the ingredients that go into constructing the tree? And it's a little bit easier to talk about the way that a tree is constructed in the context of the regression setting. So I'm going to be focusing on this setting now when I tell you about the way that the trees are constructed. Okay, so what do you do? Well, what you would do is you would start off at the root node of the tree. And the data here in the root node is just going to consist of all of your data. So all of your x's that belong to the entire support set. And what you want to do is you want to find the variable or the direction and the split point for that direction that divides the data into two groups, so divides the y data into two groups in such a way that I minimize the squared error. Okay, so this would be what would occur at the root node of the tree. And then once I do this, right, so I get my variable and my split point that minimizes the squared error here, and now I've refined the data into these two subgroups. Okay, so now I have to do the same thing, let's say at the next level of the tree. So now for each one of these subgroups, I do the same thing again, and I ask myself, okay, well, for the data, the X data that belongs to this subregion, let me find the best variable and the best split point that that minimizes the squared error. Okay, and I would do that, for each of these subnodes. Okay, and then again, I'm at the next level of the tree, right? So in this case, I'm at the second level of the tree, and and I would do that. I would do that again, right? So I would just keep refining the data by iteratively splitting it into two subgroups in each one of these regions. And the goal again is to somehow capture the heterogeneity in the data by doing this. So you're basically partitioning up the input space according to the heterogeneity in your Y variable. Okay, but you're doing it according to this squared error criterion. And this way of proceeding is sometimes known as, at least this algorithm is called the classification and regression trees, and it was proposed in the mid-'80s by Bremen and others. Okay, so just a bit of notation here. So for different regions or different nodes, I'm going to denote those by T. Okay, so T represents a particular region of the input space that's generated by this tree. And then K here is going to designate the depth of the tree. So in this case here, in this example here, I have a depth 2 tree. And these leaf nodes or these terminal nodes is what or at least the variables in these leaf nodes are what the decision tree outputs. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. But are there any questions so far, or is everything clear, or is there anything that maybe I would need to explain further? I don't know, let me just check out the chat here.
So
okay, it doesn't look like there's okay, great. So in this context, then, as I said, right, this recursive partitioning scheme creates now a rectangular partition of the input space. So in this case, let's say I just have two variables, so x1 and x2, and then through this recursive partitioning scheme, what I do is I generate then different cells, different rectangular cells of the input space, in this case, this two-dimensional space. And then what do I output in the terminal leaves here? Well, I just output the sample mean of the Y values corresponding to X values that land in these particular regions. So for example, let's suppose that I wanted to make a prediction for a new X that, say, belonged to this particular cell, so T4 here, so that would be this node here. Well, then what I would do is I would just look at all the Xi observations, and they would belong to this node T4, and then I would just average the corresponding Yi observations, and that would be the output. So the notation that I'm going to use here, so for a depth K tree, which I'll call TK, the output here is just going to be denoted mu hat, and all it is just this constant fit in each of the rectangular regions that are produced by the tree. Okay, so now how are trees used for things like heterogeneous treatment effect estimation? So in particular, if I'm interested in targeting that conditional average treatment effect that I discussed earlier, so for example, this one here. So how would trees operate then if I was to construct this? Well, let's make just a couple of simplifications, and this is a fairly strong assumption, but again, what I'm trying to do here is just to really illustrate a very, very simple setting in which decision trees can fail. Okay, so this is going to be the setting of a randomized control trial, and this is where.
Hi, Jason. Sorry to interrupt you. There's a question from Q&A.
Where do the betas come from in the minimizing function? Okay, that's a good question. Yeah. So, okay, so notice that if I fix the splitting variable and the split point, this is basically just a linear model, right? Where I have these as being kind of my features or my predictor variables, my covariates. And so in that case, then these betas just become basically the least squares coefficients. But for this particular form of the predictors, actually, these are just sample means for data that lies on these regions. And so actually you can solve for a fixed splitting variable and a fixed split point, you can solve for what these optimal beta 1s and beta 2s are, and they're again just sample means. And then of course, when you plug them back, you could plug them back into here, and now you would have something that only just depends on the split point and the splitting variable. But yeah, these are basically like you can think of these as almost like being the least squares coefficients for a fixed splitting direction and a fixed split point. But of course, when you plug them back in, they depend on those quantities. So this is a highly nonlinear model in general, right? But for a fixed splitting variable, a fixed b and a fixed j, it is a linear model. I hope, does that kind of clarify the question?
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just on that. So I was just wondering, so at each split point, you're running sort of a univariate or bivariate regression, or is it includes all the covariates, only the covariate which splits it?
It includes all the, so I run over all of the covariates, but I do it in a univariate fashion. So I'm just looking at I'm looking for the best single univariate variable that divides the data into two subgroups. So I'm only splitting along a single variable. Yeah, but I consider all P of them as potential candidates to split along. But I only choose the best one, and the best is again measured in terms of this sum of squares error.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Okay, so yeah, just going back to the causal setting. So I'm going to be assuming that I'm in a randomized controlled experimental setting. So what I'm doing here then is the assumption I'm making is that the potential outcomes as well as the pre-intervention, pre-treatment variables are completely independent of the treatment assignment variable. Okay, so remember, DI was this binary variable that indicated whether a particular unit or unit I received the treatment or not. And I'm also just going to be assuming that the so-called propensity score, the probability that a particular unit receives the treatment, is just constant across all the values of the covariates. So in other words, the probability of whether a particular unit receives the treatment or not doesn't depend on these pre-intervention variables here. Okay, and so under this assumption, you can then rewrite this conditional average treatment effect in two different ways. So one of them is as follows, where you just look at the yi's, but now you condition on the x and on the particular unit receiving a treatment, and then you subtract from that the yi conditioned on the covariate and the unit not receiving the treatment. And so this is one way of rewriting this conditional average treatment effect. And then the other way is to basically just reweight the observations by this probability of treatment assignment. Okay, so sometimes this is called like inverse probability weighting. And anyways, in this way, you can again equivalently rewrite this conditional average treatment effect. And this actually motivates two different ways of now estimating my conditional average treatment effect using decision trees. So now there's a couple of different ways that you could construct a decision tree. One of them involves sample splitting and the other doesn't involve sample splitting. The one that involves sample splitting is sometimes called honesty. And this was, at least for in the context of trees, this was proposed by Athian and Bins. Actually, this is incorrect. This should be actually 2016. And what they do there is they assume that the yi values here are not the same as the data that was used to construct the partition. So to construct these particular nodes, the split points and the splitting variables. And that's, anyways, that way of constructing trees is known as honesty. So again, you split your data, and for one group of the split data you use for constructing the tree structure, right? So for finding the split variables and the split points, and then the other for producing the estimates of the in the context of causal models, the conditional average treatment effect. Okay, and this, there's some kind of nice thing that you get because this naturally enforces a kind of independence between the output of the tree and then the construction of the tree and the partition that is created from it. Okay, so naturally, what you can do then with these honest trees is now what you can do is you can kind of try to mimic what these expected values are for these different forms of the conditional average treatment effect, and you can kind of match them in terms of the output of the tree, right? So really what you could do now is you could say, for example, if I wanted to target this quantity here, well, all I would do is I would just look at now in a particular region of the tree, I would just output the this variable here for xi's that land in that particular node. And again, if you wanted to, you could do this sample splitting so that you would make this variable here independent of the data that was used to generate the decision nodes here, the regions of the input space. And again, you could do something similar here. So actually, technically, there's a bit of a technical thing here. So technically, actually, when you're growing the tree using this type of an estimate, you don't actually use the sum of squares error. You use sort of a variant of it called the adjusted expected mean squared error. But what I do want to say is that it really doesn't matter whether you do any of it. So whether you use honesty, whether you use sample splitting, whether you use this form or this form to target the conditional average treatment effect or to estimate it, you really reach the same conclusions in the end. And the examples that I'm going to show you hold for any of those cases. So even though, yeah, empirically, these different variations of trees can lead to sometimes better performance, in the specific examples that I'll show you, they really actually don't help, and you're still stuck with this kind of bad performance. But anyways, this is sort of just to give you an idea of the different variations of the estimates that could be produced using a tree. So let's just see, are there any questions now? I don't think there's any questions.
Not yet, I don't think so.
Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, because there's, again, these different variations, and I don't have time to kind of focus on the theory for each one of them, what I'll do is, again, I'm just going to go back to the regression setting. So this setting here, and I'm just going to focus on what would happen if I wanted to now estimate this this conditional expected value of y given x. But just believe me when I say that you can convert any of the statements that I'm about to say for the regression setting to a similar setting in a causal model. Okay, so under this assumption. Okay, so what is the setting that I'm going to show that trees kind of don't really perform very well? So it's really a setting where you don't have any heterogeneity in the data. So in other words, the treatment effect or the regression function doesn't vary with the covariates. In other words, it's just constant. Now, of course, you don't know that a priori, right? But you're going to be using a method that thinks that there is some heterogeneity, right? So trees kind of naturally think that they're well suited to the setting where there is heterogeneity. But what happens if there actually isn't any heterogeneity and you use a decision tree? So here the setting is where this regression function is just constant. So for all x's that are in my support. And then there's just some other technical assumptions that I have to assume. So just that xi is continuous. The errors that I make are the error in the outcomes are independent of the covariates. And then I just need a mild kind of moment assumption on the noise distribution. So it just has slightly higher moments than just second order. Okay, and so under this setting, we'll show that trees really just aren't going to work very well, I think. So is there a question? I think I heard maybe some. Okay, yeah. So, and again, so this is a setting where in the regression framework, where you don't have any heterogeneity in the response values, or in the setting of a causal model, this would be where the treatment effect is just constant and it doesn't vary with the x's.
Jason, we've got a question.
Yeah. Okay, sure. Is the propensity score also generated using sample splitting? It could be. It could be. And in fact, actually, sometimes, so in multi-step non-parametrics, sometimes people actually use, multi-step semi-parametrics, people actually use trees for estimating other functions that are used for downstream tasks. So for example, you could actually use a decision tree to estimate, for example, the propensity score, because this is really now just almost like a classification problem. But yeah, you could use sample splitting if you wanted to, but you don't necessarily have to. Here I would be assuming, so when I construct, for example, this here, I would be assuming that I knew what the propensity score was. But in a more, in a more general context where maybe it varies or I don't know what it is, yeah, then I could employ one of these strategies where I use sample splitting or not, or I could use a tree to estimate it or not. So it really depends. Okay, so let's see what happens now if I use a method which is hungry for heterogeneity, but when in fact the state of reality is that there is no heterogeneity. Okay, so let's see what happens. Okay, so here's the result. So basically what it says is you give me a particular rate of convergence, okay, as a function of the sample size. So for example, root n convergence would be the case where the exponent is a half, but you can give me any rate. So any rate that's gamma, and this gamma here can belong from 0 to 1/2. Okay, and then you give me also any delta. Well, then the result says that I can find constants and a sample size so that, and an integer such that if my sample size is large enough, the error that a tree makes in estimating the regression function uniformly over all the covariates is at least that arbitrary rate that you gave me, right? So gamma here can be as small as you want, and this poor rate holds with probability at least 1 minus delta. So almost with probability 1 does this rate hold. So in other words, what this says is that this tree here cannot converge at a rate, or converges basically a rate that's slower than any polynomial. Okay, and here what I've done is I've just actually shown this for a depth 1 tree. Okay, so in other words, this is what you would get if you just did this. If you just did this first split here. Okay, so you did this nonlinear optimization and you found the best splitting variable and the best split points. You just did this once. Okay, so why does this occur? Well, it happens actually because the optimal split point that you get tends to concentrate near the boundaries of your support set. And because the split point tends to concentrate near the boundaries, if you want to do local estimation close to the boundary of the support set, so close to the boundary of X, then you're just really not going to have a lot of data in there naturally, because again, the split point concentrates very close to it. And this is kind of what gives rise to this poor performance. So, but again, really what this shows is that if you're really interested in conducting uniform inference, so really what you want sort of a uniform error control. So you want this estimate to be close to mu for all values of the covariates. You're really going to be stuck with these extremely slow rates. They're not. It's not going to be enough that you can employ things like, let's say, like maybe central limit theorem type arguments, and it's really just not going to suffice. In fact, actually, if you're exactly at the boundary of the support set, this rate actually becomes logarithmic. So if you choose a value of X that's exactly at one of the boundaries, this rate becomes logarithmic. So in other words, you need a huge number of samples if you want to guarantee that this uniform error is small. Okay, any questions? Okay, so here's just a simulation of what this looks like. So just looking on the left plot here, what I'm doing is I'm plotting the pointwise mean squared error. So just looking at the mean squared error for a specific value of the covariates in a one-dimensional setting here. And I'm choosing my constant regression function to be 0, my errors to be normal, and I'm just choosing a sample size of 1,000. Okay, and so here what I'm doing is I'm plotting the pointwise root mean squared error for that depth 1 decision tree across the values of the covariates. And you can see here that the trouble really occurs. I have very, very large error close to the boundaries, and it kind of becomes a little bit better as I get towards the center of the support of the covariates. Okay, so this is in the regression context, and okay, so now I could go to the give you an example now for a causal model with a constant treatment effect. So here now tau does not vary with the covariates; it's just 1. And I choose the treatment indicator variable just to be Bernoulli 1/2. With half probability, my units are either assigned the control or the treatment. And the errors here are also going to be normal. And then my sample size is also going to be 1,000. And this is using this methodology of Appian imbins in 2016. So this is this one here, actually. Where, remember I said that they use a slightly different criterion for determining the split points and the splitting values. Rather than using squared error, they use something slightly different. But nevertheless, in terms of the simulations here, we actually see that it gives you similarly bad performance, right? So it really kind of suffers near the boundaries of the support set. And again, this is just a feature of the fact that when you do this optimization, the split points that you get, the optimal values, tend to concentrate close to the edges. And so the cells that are produced just contain very, very few samples. And so local estimation then it basically becomes not very accurate because you're just averaging very few samples.
Jason, there is a question.
Yeah. Okay, sure. Okay, so any impressions on why this? Yeah, that's a good question. So the machinery that we use to prove that is fairly high powered. It's something that it's called the Darling-Erdős theorem, and it's used for understanding the asymptotics of the supremum of sort of a sample average in a very, very precise way. And the only thing that I could say is just that the tree is really trying to do something in some sense kind of sensible. So it's trying to give you sort of the largest region in which the function will be actually a pretty good estimate, right? So for example, if the split point tends to occur, or the optimal split points tend to occur over here or over here, well, then the majority of the support actually is pretty good because it's just going to output the average here and it's going to be fairly reasonable. But the problem is that there is going to be one little region here where it's not going to do very well. So the tree it's trying to do something sensible because it is detecting that there isn't a lot of heterogeneity. And so it's like, okay, well, then I shouldn't be splitting kind of towards the middle. So let me just be very extreme and try to push the split points towards the boundaries. But because, again, we're not in an infinite sample setting, it's not actually going to be exactly at the edge, right, at 0 or 1 in this case. It's going to be kind of close to the edge. But that still renders a situation where now if you want to make a prediction very, very close to that edge, it's still going to be poor. Okay, so another question is, so thanks for that question. That was really good. But yeah, the intuition, it really is just more like a mathematical fact. It's sort of the way that the proofs work. But I think the way of explaining it is just that the tree is trying to do something sensible. It's just that if we're interested now in uniform inference, it does leave regions of the space where you have very few samples, even though it kind of is trying to do the right thing, right? Leave you with a large region that it does do well on. So that's kind of the best way I think that I could explain it. So another question is, will tuning the size of the terminal nodes help? So yeah, tuning the size of the terminal nodes definitely will help. I guess the way that I would respond to that is that any rule that you use for trying to help the tree will also have to work in other settings as well, right? Because remember here, you're deploying this in practice. You don't actually know, for example, whether the effect is the treatment effect or the regression function is constant or not, right? You don't know a priori whether it's heterogeneous or not. So if you apply a rule to the tree, so for example, maybe trimming or using a rule and saying, okay, I'm only going to make a prediction if the nodes contain a certain number of sample points, then that also has to be good in other settings as well, right? Where maybe you do actually have heterogeneity and you might not want to always do that. But yeah, if you knew a priori that the regression function was constant, then yeah, there probably are ways of avoiding this, like by tuning or by making some threshold according to the size of the number of samples in the nodes. But again, you don't know a priori whether that's going to be a good thing in all situations where you do have possibly heterogeneity. So I don't know, I hope that maybe that explains or answers that question. Yeah, good. That's a great question, though. I mean, the natural thing I think to do is to think about, well, how do we fix it? But the challenge here is that you don't want to modify the methodology so that it becomes problematic in other scenarios or other situations. So, okay, so remember I said that the optimal split point will concentrate near the boundaries for a depth 1 tree. So even at the first, after the first split point, you will see this concentration of the split points near the boundaries, leading to poor errors or bad errors that are made in those regions. Of course, now if you iterate this, so if you now grow a tree, a deeper tree, I mean, it's only going to exacerbate the problem. And in fact, what you can show is that if you have, let's say, an exceedingly deep tree, an exceedingly shallow tree. So if the depth of the tree is only, for example, like log n. So for example, just to put this in context, if n is a billion, so if you have a billion sample sizes, then log n is roughly 3. So even for a billion samples, if you have a depth 3 tree, then not only do you get a rate that's slower than any polynomial, well, it's actually going to be a constant rate. So in other words, it's going to be inconsistent. So you can show that with high probability, for large enough sample sizes, the error that you make will be constant. It's not going to be small. Okay, so now just to contrast this with what you would get with the with a softer measure of error. So for example, if you're just interested now, maybe not so severely as the uniform error, but you're just interested in the error that the tree makes for, let's say, an average value of the covariates. Well, you can show that a tree that has this depth here has an integrated mean squared error. So here I'm just taking the integrated mean squared error. It has an error that's actually root n optimal, right? So in other words, the rate at which this mean squared error converges as a function of the sample size is optimal, right? And it's going to be sigma squared over n, because actually, if you think about it, for this model here, you know, I mean, you have a constant or like an intercept only regression model, a constant regression model. Well, the optimal thing to do is actually just to output the sample mean, right? And that sample mean is going to have, roughly speaking, root n. It's going to have root n convergence. And so actually, if you measured the tree using a less stringent form of accuracy, you would actually get led to something that's optimal. So the point here is just that there's a huge difference between, at least with these adaptive decision trees, there's a huge difference between how you measure performance. So if it's uniform, you get inconsistency. But if it's with respect to mean squared error, then you actually get optimal rates, right? But what you actually need in practice typically is you need something strong like this, right? You really do care about, for a specific value of the covariates, how well is the tree estimating the target, right? This is just going to be too weak. And indeed, actually, a lot of theory in sort of applications of machine learning and causal inference really actually does require that you have a uniform control over the errors, and mean squared error just doesn't cut it. So, but anyways, this theory again represents that, or suggests that the way that you measure performance matters a lot, and you're just not going to get this good uniform performance for these decision trees in even like the simplest of settings. Okay, so what these results show is that shallow, honest causal trees. So, by the way, honesty here doesn't really matter. So whether I do sample splitting or not, you'll actually still get these same rates, and you'll get the same poor performance. So it doesn't matter. So what these results show are that these shallow trees are uniformly inconsistent. The inconsistency is actually just due to a variance issue. It's not due to sort of like let's say a boundary issue like you would get maybe with a kernel method, or let's say a misspecification bias, because you can actually show that for these trees, if the noise distribution is symmetric, then they're actually unbiased. These the estimates that are produced by these trees for a fixed value of the covariates. So if I fix a value of x and I average the outcomes with respect to the data distribution, then that is actually going to be equal to the target. So it's unbiased. So the whole issue is due to the variance. It's not due to the bias, or it's not due to the same kind of maybe boundary problems that you would see with other types of estimators, such as like kernels, for example. Now I mentioned that the inconsistency here, you have trouble near the boundaries. Well, actually, it turns out that you in fact, you can show us that you actually have inconsistency at countably infinitely many points in the support. So there's possibly a huge number of points at which you do actually get inconsistency. Going beyond non-constant models, you also do have similar problems too. And the reason is because the way that the tree makes splits or decides how to partition the data is based only on marginal information. So it's based only on the value, how the Y data changes for a single covariate, right? So it only makes splits based on marginal information. So for example, if you had a setting where the conditional expectation of Y given a particular covariate, or let's say all the covariates, was constant, then in effect, you're actually just basically back to the same setting that I was discussing earlier, where you just have a constant regression function. Because again, marginally here now, the tree will think that, oh, it actually, or marginally here, that you'll be in a situation where the tree is basically fitting a constant regression model, right? Because again, it only uses marginal information. And indeed, you can show, again, you can make this formal and make this precise, that even in settings where you don't have, you maybe have a non-constant regression function, but marginally you don't have, let's say, any information. So these conditional expectations conditioned on a particular covariate is constant, then you can actually also result in the same type of behaviors. In other words, the split points will also concentrate near the boundaries, leading to certain issues. And actually, in this case, pruning, which is one way that you can sometimes reduce the variability, right? Reduce the overfitting. It actually won't help here at all, because what's going to happen is if you're in a situation like this where marginally you have constant information, then even after the first split, you're going to have these regions that contain very few samples, and so really pruning isn't going to help. It's just not going to do the thing that you want. Okay, so maybe let's discuss. So what's an easy fix for this? Well, the easy fix is actually just to use random forests. Now, there's maybe some cost to doing this. So for example, you do lose the interpretability that you started off with that was maybe kind of appealing with these tree-based methods. And you can also introduce other tuning parameters, which, maybe could be cumbersome to tune. But in any case, what you can do is you can actually restore these optimal rates, so these root n optimal rates that are only present with trees if you're measuring the accuracy for sort of an average or typical value of the covariates. So through the integrated mean squared error, you can actually restore that same accuracy, but in a pointwise sense, using random forests. Okay, so how are these random forests generated? Well, these are actually just used using the methodology of Wager and Athey called causal random forests. And again, they use this honesty, so they use this sample splitting when they construct the constituent trees of the forest. But how does this work? Well, basically what you do is you grow each tree in the forest, in the ensemble, using a subsample of the data of size S. So S here is going to be something that's less than or equal to n. Typically, it's some low order polynomial in n. And then at each node of the tree, you don't choose the optimal splitting covariate among all the p covariates. What you do is you first generate a random subset of those p covariates of size m, and then among those you choose the best splitting variable. Okay, so if you construct each of the trees in this way, sort of independently in this way, and you average them, of course, then you get a random forest, and you can show now that the error here, so that the uniform error here. So again, I'm taking the supremum here over all values of the covariates, ignoring this factor here, which is small. You're now restoring these optimal rates. So the sigma squared over n rates. Okay, but again, you're losing some things here too, because again, you're going to a method now which is a little bit less interpretable. Okay, so this actually describes in sort of a formal sense this tension or this trade-off between an interpretability and accuracy. But of course, if you're in a very high stakes environment, maybe you care, but you probably care with going with a more accurate method. Maybe you're willing to give up with a little bit of interpretability. But in any case, this does show that there is sort of an easy way of fixing this, which is really to just consider an ensemble method and look at an average of a bunch of these trees. And then you can go from something that's inconsistent actually to something that is consistent and consistent actually at the optimal rate. Okay, in a uniform sense. Okay, so if you run the same simulations here, so notice, okay, so let me just compare. So if I do the same thing that I did here, so just these two models here, but I used that random forest methodology, the errors that you can see are going to be much better. So the errors that you make, you still have a little bit of an issue near the boundaries, but you can actually check that the error is roughly in line with this this root n optimal convergence rate. So the errors are definitely smaller, and you can see this right in these simulations here. So I think there was a question in the forest, what betas are generated from the model? Does it show us what are the betas associated with each covariate? So in the forest, so with the betas, do you mean the betas that I started off with when I was showing the tree construction? So do you mean these betas here? So does it show us what are the betas associated with each covariate? I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Yes, we'll be able to infer dy dx in a forest. Yeah, so I mean, if you wanted to understand the way that particular variables are associated with the outcomes, there are different types of variable importance measures that one can use with the forest that will tell you how to do that. But I'm not really considering that in this context here. So I'm not really considering variable selection here.
Jason, I think there is a raised hand.
Oh, okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah,
so
sure.
I just wanted to follow up on this forest method. So if you're running, if it constructs multiple trees and the mu hat x is an average, so the treatment effect is the average of all the trees.
Yeah, it'll be so this is what so again, here I'm doing it for the regression setting, but yeah, in the context of causal random forest, what you would be doing then is you would be in some sense averaging these outputs that are made by the individual tree. Yeah, but each tree is itself constructed using subsample data, and at each node, you're not actually optimizing over all the variables when you're deciding the splitting variable. You're looking at a random subset of them. But yeah, in effect, in the end, what you're doing is you're just averaging the outputs of the individual trees, or the estimates of the treatment effects for the individual trees. Yeah.
So I guess my question was that, like in a least squares estimate, you would be able to get to know what your beta is associated with, you know, with a covariate called male, or like a gender, or with household income or something. Will a forest also be able to just spit out that we would be able to know what is the effect of each covariate on the outcome?
I wouldn't look at the betas individually. What I would do is again, there are various variable importance measures that one can create that sort of aggregate the information about how the trees are using particular variables and how they affect either the response values or the treatment effects. But yeah, it's kind of outside the scope of the talk, and but it's definitely available in literature. So if you're interested, I think you just search for like variable importance measures for forests. But there's no formal guarantees for those. It's really just all relegated to empirical stuff. So you wouldn't get, say, the same formal guarantees that you would get if, say, the underlying model was linear, and then you use, let's say, a linear method or a sieve method or a series method to do it. So the types of guarantees that you get for these highly nonlinear data adaptive methods are really scarce, and you're not going to have any kind of formal guarantees. But you can still do it. You can still aggregate the information And it's done through these variable importance measures, and they can still tell you something about the way that the outcomes are related to the covariates.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here, and I just want to mention one thing. So adaptive decision trees are still good for certain tasks. And they're definitely a leading component in one's toolkit that you should still be using. The main takeaway, I think, from these results is that you should just be careful about a mechanical application of some of these very powerful, very adaptive machine learning methodologies, especially for tasks that require good quality estimates at specific values of the covariates. So again, if you want to conduct something like uniform inference, where again, you care about having good estimates at a specific covariate value of interest. There's some evidence, again, this is more empirical evidence, to suggest that actually neural networks also have similar poor performance, but we don't really have any formal theory at this point. It's more just empirical work. But at least for trees, we can isolate settings where provably theoretically provably they will not work very well, and you do need to consider alternative methods, like, for example, random forest. So the takeaway is just to be careful and to know that there are pitfalls for some of these methods that people use, and one should be very careful. Okay, so the reference for this talk here is on my website or on arXiv. And I also want to thank the NSF for funding this research. So I will end here, and I'll say thanks a lot for all the great questions. Very, very interesting, and I'm happy to take more now.